I'm also joined by a very special guest at this stage to take a broader look at some of the announcements made by Nirmala Sitharaman. The senior Congress leader Shashi Tharoor joins me. Thanks, Mr. Tharoor, very much for being with us. Now, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "The budget is full of new possibilities for more infrastructure, more investment, more jobs and more growth." Do you share this opinion that this is a job and growth-oriented budget?
No, I mean, possibilities are a particularly convenient term because the possibilities exist for everything, but the track record of this government has not been particularly inspiring. I mean, the one thing that seems really ambitious and visionary is the announcement of a 35% increase in capital expenditure, the big capex boost. But if you really look at the performance of the government on capital expenditure, just take last year, each of the last 3 quarters, the actual expenditure and capital expenditure went down. The quarter ending June, the quarter ending September, the quarter ending December showed a reduction in actual expenditure on capital. So the fact is that if you really think about what the government's talking about, you have to ask yourself, do we listen to what they say or do we watch what they do? And until it actually happens, for me, I'm only going to believe it when I see it.
Now, the Prime Minister said the budget addresses the immediate needs to ensure that the economy is robust. He says that there's going to be the budget ensures more investment will happen, there will be more infrastructure growth, and there would certainly, infrastructure being a big focus. So roads is an area, for example, so how is this not correct? I mean, the big focus on infrastructure.
Well, look, roads are one area where the government doesn't have a bad track record. So I'm pleased that there's going to be a serious commitment to improving infrastructure, this new slogan of PM Gati Shakti and so on. But once again, everything is about implementation. And infrastructure, don't forget, is not only about roads. There's an enormous amount that needs to be addressed. And what about human beings? I mean, when you look at the fact that there is absolutely nothing there addressing the inflation crisis in the country, that unemployment is the worst it's ever been in the history of recorded figures in unemployment. 53 million Indians don't have a job, and the best that the government can promise in today's speech is 60 lakh jobs over 5 years. That's 6 million. So you're not even 10% of today's unemployment is being addressed in the next 5 years. That is a real insult to the common Indian, because we've seen in last week's horrible riot and burning of trains and so on and Bihar that people are desperate. They need jobs for their own self-respect, to be able to feed their families, to lead a decent life, and this government has simply not been able to deliver on that front. Those are the issues that really worry me much more than these big macro announcements.
Sure.
We've seen such announcements before and they haven't changed the life of the ordinary Indian anywhere.
What about Manrega? It's a program, a flagship program for so many years, which lakhs of people depended on, particularly given the COVID situation. But the financial backing of Manrega has come down massively this time around. What do you think is going to be the impact of that?
They've reduced it.
How? No, but how exactly?
Absolutely, because in fact demand for Manrega has gone up each of the 2 years of the pandemic. As more and more people don't have other work, they've turned to Manrega in despair, and each year the government's budget has been found wanting. Last year I pointed this out in my budget speech in the Lok Sabha, and when they came back for supplementary demands for more money, I said, listen, you could have anticipated this. We all told you were not asking for enough. Now, despite that additional amount last time, they still have over 20,000 crores in pending dues, and still they've gone back to a lower budget than they had at the end of last year. So already they have a lower budget, and against that lower budget they have increased dues from last year to pay. We're going to end up in another disaster this year. Last year, the people who asked for work got only an average of 52 days of work, whereas the scheme is supposed to deliver you 100 days of work. How are people going to survive in our country? This government shows no responsibility for the poor, for the ordinary person.
One of the areas which, considering the problems we are facing on our borders, whether it's Pakistan or China, is obviously the defense sector. But year after year, there is hardly ever a mention of the defense budget in the speech of the finance minister, who in this case has been a defense minister herself. there is a jump in the capital expenditure, but it's a very small jump. It's just 13,100 odd crore rupees spread across the three services. Again, is this an area which, despite the threats we face, we're just not spending enough on?
Well, in fact, last year there was no increase at all. It was actually a decrease. And I pointed out that for 2 years in a row, the finance minister hadn't mentioned the word defense in her budget speech. I think that this is a token stab at acknowledging. That's right.
No, you're quite right. In fact, in a situation like this, it's particularly important. In fact, that 9.7% jump in the capital budget might sound impressive, but the rupee number is actually absolutely minuscule. It actually translates if one were to make a crude translation into just a handful of Rafale jets split across all the three forces.
Yeah, absolutely. Third time it hasn't. In fact, I had to actually wait for the numbers to reach me because it wasn't in the speech to realize that there is a modest increase, but the increase is too modest. Remember, once you account for the factor of inflation in our country, and inflation is very high, the increase may be no increase at all.
So one final question, Mr. Tharoor. A lot has been said about cryptocurrencies. There are fears, and perhaps many of them are valid fears about crypto assets and cryptocurrencies, being a security threat at one level, who controls them, who regulates them, etc., etc. There's a strong message which has been sent out by this government now. They're taxing cryptocurrencies very heavily, other than the RBI currency, which is going to come out. There's also a lot which has been said about crypto assets. Where do you stand on some of the announcements which have been made?
So their argument basically, and I must say I have a sneaking respect for that position, even though your techie types will tell you it's out of date and it's wrong, but their position is that the only currency that can be called currency is something backed up by a sovereign state central bank. And so only the digital rupee issued by the Reserve Bank of India will be called cryptocurrency in India. Every other thing like Bitcoin and Ethereum and so on, that will be a digital asset. And digital asset, if you transfer it as if it were currency, well, it will be treated as an asset and taxed at 30%. That's the government stand. It's better than what some people were fearing, which is a ban on these digital assets. But because the government, as you know, has not so far interfered with those assets being sold to Indians. But let's face it, Vikram, it's still something that a very, very tiny, minuscule percentage of the Indian population is affected by. What we have to worry about is where is the income tax relief for the middle class? And indeed, as somebody was saying, many of us don't have any income, so perhaps we shouldn't be disappointed they haven't done anything about income tax. That's how terrible the situation is for average people. And I think the government really must realize that this reference to an Aam Aadmi is not just a cliche. The bulk of Indians are desperately vulnerable today, have become more vulnerable over the 2 years of the pandemic, and the government's budget has nothing for them, not even a token nod at their needs and concerns in a moment of crisis.
All right. Shashi Tharoor, wonderful speaking to you. Thank you very much for joining us, sharing some of your concerns on the budget this year.